They won the war. The flags were raised. The guns fell silent. And only then did Dwight D. Eisenhower finally say the words he had buried for years. George Patton was the most dangerous man I ever needed. Dangerous not to the Germans, but to the Allied war effort itself. This is the hidden truth Eisenhower never dared speak during the war, and a quiet battle he fought to keep America as most aggressive general from destroying the victory he helped create. By 1944, George S. Patton was no longer just a general. He was a force of nature, steel helmet polished to a shine, pistols worn like a warning. Patton moved faster, attacked harder, and broke enemy lines with a violence that stunned both sides. German commanders feared him. American soldiers followed him. And Eisenhower, supreme commander of Allied forces, depended on him more than he ever admitted. Patton's Third Army did the impossible. When others stalled, Patton advanced. When fuel ran dry, he somehow found more. When German defenses looked unbreakable, he smashed through them with speed no doctrine had prepared for. Eisenhower saw the results clearly. Every mile Patton gained shortened the war. Every breakthrough saved weeks, maybe months of bloodshed. But behind closed doors, Eisenhower saw something else too. Patton didn't just fight the enemy. He fought control. He ignored orders when they slowed him down. He insulted allies. He treated war like a personal test of dominance, not a coordinated global effort. And Eisenhower knew the truth most Americans never would. A general who moves too fast can collapse an entire alliance. Eisenhower wasn't asking, "Can Patton win?" He was asking, "How do I stop him from winning the wrong way?" Because one reckless push, one diplomatic disaster, one uncontrolled outburst could hand the Allies a victory. So fractured it might not survive the peace. And Eisenhower had already seen the warning signs. The slapping incident, the public embarrassments, the growing belief inside Patton that rules were for lesser men. Patton thought aggression won wars. Eisenhower knew wars were won by balance, and soon those two philosophies were going to collide. Eisenhower's greatest fear wasn't German counterattacks. It wasn't supply shortages. It wasn't even failure on the battlefield. It was Patton unrestrained. By the time Allied forces broke out of Normandy, Patton's Third Army was moving at a pace no one could match. His tanks sliced across France so fast that maps became useless. German commanders thought multiple armies were attacking, when in reality, it was Patton striking again and again, never letting them breathe. Militarily, it was brilliant. Politically, it was a nightmare. Patton spoke openly about marching straight into Germany, then into Eastern Europe, then confronting the Soviets. He dismissed allies, mocked British commanders, and treated coalition warfare like a nuisance slowing his destiny. Eisenhower understood something Patton refused to accept. World War II wasn't just a military campaign, it was a diplomatic minefield. Every move had to consider Stalin. Every advance had to respect Allied agreements. Every public statement had to preserve unity. Patton didn't care. So Eisenhower did the unthinkable. He held back his most effective weapon. Fuel convoys were redirected. Orders were delayed. Operational freedom was quietly restricted. Not because Patton was failing, but because he was succeeding too dangerously. In private, Eisenhower admitted Patton terrified him. Not for what he couldn't do, but for what he would do if left unchecked. And then came the moment that proved Eisenhower right. Patton began openly criticizing denazification, defending former German officers, and speaking as if the war's political consequences didn't matter. To Eisenhower, this wasn't just reckless. It threatened the fragile peace being built before the fighting even ended. Eisenhower didn't remove Patton because he was weak. He sidelined him because Patton was too powerful to control. The war demanded restraint. Patton only understood momentum, and when victory finally came, Eisenhower faced a brutal realization. The man who helped win the war might have made the peace impossible. But the most revealing truth wouldn't come during the fighting. It would come after the victory, when Eisenhower finally spoke honestly, without cameras, without speeches, without propaganda, and what he admitted would change how history remembered Patton forever. After Germany surrendered, the world expected unity. Parades rolled through liberated cities. Flags waved. Victory speeches filled the air. But behind closed doors, Eisenhower was exhausted not from the enemy, but from Patton. With the war officially over, the leash Eisenhower had kept tight during combat began to snap. Patton spoke freely, unfiltered, and dangerously. He compared former Nazis to American politicians. He dismissed denazification as foolish. He suggested Germany would need its old leadership again to stand against communism. To Eisenhower, this wasn't opinion, it was a diplomatic landmine. The Allies were trying to stabilize Europe. The Soviets were watching every word. And Patton was treating the post-war world like another battlefield. In private conversations, Eisenhower finally admitted the truth he had hidden for years. Patton was not just a general, he was a force of nature. And like any force of nature, he caused destruction even when he was right. Eisenhower confessed that Patton's instincts were often correct, but his lack of restraint made him dangerous in a world that required balance, patience, and compromise. Eisenhower didn't doubt Patton's loyalty. He doubted Patton's ability to stop. The same aggression that smashed German defenses now threatened Allied unity. The same blunt honesty that inspired soldiers now embarrassed governments. And Eisenhower realized something chilling. If Patton remained in command during the fragile aftermath, he could ignite conflicts the Allies weren't ready to fight. So Eisenhower did what leaders often must. He chose stability over brilliance. Patton was sidelined, quietly removed from meaningful command, publicly praised, privately neutralized, and when Patton died just months later, Eisenhower's reaction stunned those closest to him. He mourned deeply not just the loss of a great general, but the burden of having to control one. In a rare moment of honesty, Eisenhower admitted that Patton had been both essential and unbearable, the weapon that wins wars, but cannot be left lying around afterward. But the final truth, the one that haunted Eisenhower, came years later, because deep down, he knew something unsettling. Without Patton, victory would have taken longer. With Patton unleashed, the peace might not have survived. And that contradiction defined everything. Long after the medals were pinned and the speeches faded, Eisenhower carried a private weight no one saw. Because history remembers victories, commanders remember costs. In letters never meant for headlines, Eisenhower reflected on Patton with a mix of admiration and quiet dread. He admitted that no Allied general moved faster, hit harder, or terrified the Germans more. When Patton attacked, entire enemy fronts collapsed, not slowly, but violently, as if the war itself was running from him. Yet Eisenhower also knew something most soldiers never had to face. A commander doesn't just win battles, he protects the future. Patton didn't think that way. He believed wars were meant to be fought brutally and ended decisively. Politics disgusted him. Diplomacy bored him. He once said that hesitation killed more men than bullets, and he meant it. Eisenhower, on the other hand, was fighting two wars at once. One against Germany, another against chaos inside his own alliance. Every time Patton spoke, Eisenhower had to calculate the fallout. Every time Patton advanced, Eisenhower had to ensure he didn't overextend. And every time Patton embarrassed the Allies, Eisenhower had to quietly repair the damage. With apologies, explanations, and restraint, Eisenhower once admitted that controlling Patton required more energy than fighting entire German armies. That wasn't an insult. It was a confession. He described Patton as a blade unmatched in combat, but impossible to sheath safely. And Eisenhower understood that leadership wasn't about unleashing every weapon. It was about knowing when to hold one back. This realization haunted him, because while Eisenhower succeeded as supreme commander, part of him wondered what might have happened if Patton had been allowed to fight without restraint, and whether the war would have ended sooner, or the world burned afterward. In the end, Eisenhower reached a conclusion few leaders ever say out loud. Patton was necessary, but only under control. Heroic, but not governable. Brilliant, but unsustainable. That truth shaped Eisenhower's presidency. his caution during the Cold War, and his deep distrust of unchecked military power, because he had seen it up close. He had commanded it, and he had survived it. By 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing, but Eisenhower's dilemma remained. Patton was still Patton. Even as German resistance crumbled, Patton pushed harder. He drove his Third Army across rivers thought impassable, smashed through collapsing defenses, and liberated towns at a speed that left other Allied commanders stunned. German officers later admitted the truth. Patton's movements felt unpredictable, almost reckless, and that terrified them more than Allied air power. Eisenhower saw the results clearly. When Patton was unleashed, breakthroughs happened. When Patton was restrained, momentum slowed, and that contradiction became Eisenhower's greatest burden. Eisenhower privately admitted that if Patton didn't exist, the Allies would have had to invent someone like him, and then immediately struggle to control him. Patton wasn't just a general. He was psychological warfare in human form. His reputation traveled ahead of his tanks. German units retreated before contact simply because they believed Patton was coming. No other Allied commander inspired that kind of fear. And yet, Eisenhower never fully trusted him. Patton ignored orders when he felt they interfered with victory. He insulted allies. He spoke openly about continuing the war beyond Germany, statements that terrified politicians, already thinking about peace and reconstruction. Eisenhower understood something Patton refused to accept. Winning the war wasn't enough. The peace afterward mattered just as much. Every reckless statement Patton made risked shattering Allied unity. Every unauthorized advance threatened diplomatic fallout. Eisenhower had to constantly decide whether Patton's battlefield genius outweighed the political damage he caused. And still, Eisenhower kept him. Why? Because deep down, Eisenhower knew the truth. There were moments when only Patton could do the impossible. Only Patton could force a collapsing enemy to surrender faster. Only Patton could exploit chaos at lightning speed. Eisenhower once confessed that removing Patton permanently would have been easier, but also dangerous, because war doesn't forgive caution forever. Patton was the storm Eisenhower feared, but also the storm he needed, and that knowledge followed Eisenhower long after the guns went silent. When the war finally ended, something strange happened to George Patton. He didn't celebrate. While other commanders spoke of victory, rebuilding, and peace, Patton looked restless, almost lost. The war that had given him purpose, clarity, and meaning was over, and Eisenhower noticed it. Immediately, Patton began saying things he should never have said. He criticized post-war policies. He openly compared former Nazis to future enemies. He spoke as if the war hadn't truly ended, as if it had merely paused. To politicians and diplomats, it sounded dangerous. To Eisenhower, it sounded tragic. Eisenhower later admitted that Patton was built for war and almost useless without it. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower wrestled with guilt. He had spent years restraining Patton, shielding the Allies from his excesses, but also relying on his aggression to win battles faster. Now that same man had no battlefield left to fight on, and Eisenhower knew something. Uncomfortable, Patton's recklessness hadn't disappeared, it had simply lost its outlet. The press turned against him. Political patience evaporated. Eisenhower quietly removed Patton from meaningful command, assigning him to administrative duties that felt like exile. Officially, it was routine. In reality, it was a slow dismissal. Patton felt betrayed. He believed victory had earned him trust, freedom, recognition. Instead, he found himself sidelined, watched, and corrected like a liability. Eisenhower didn't defend him publicly, and that decision haunted him, because Eisenhower understood the cruel irony. The very qualities that made Patton indispensable in war made him unacceptable in peace. There was no middle ground. No safe way to keep a man like Patton relevant once the fighting stopped. In private, Eisenhower admitted that history would judge Patton harshly, not for his failures in combat, but for his inability to adapt to peace. And Eisenhower wondered something few dared to say aloud. Had he used Patton up, and then discarded him, the war had ended? The silence was deafening, and Patton, once unstoppable, was now alone. Eisenhower carried a secret, one he revealed only in private conversations. Decades later, to those who asked, he confessed that George Patton was perhaps the most talented field commander of his generation. No one could push armored divisions faster, strike harder, or inspire troops like Patton did. His intuition on the battlefield was almost uncanny, a gift few could match, and none could replace. Yet, Eisenhower also admitted something uncomfortable. Patton was uncontrollable. His decisions, while often brilliant, carried risk that could have jeopardized entire campaigns. Every time Patton went full throttle, Eisenhower's staff braced for disaster. One wrong move, one misjudged maneuver, and weeks of careful planning could have crumbled in an instant. Eisenhower said, in his private reflections, that Patton was a weapon, and like any weapon, he had to be handled carefully or risk backfiring spectacularly. He trusted Patton to break German lines in the Ardennes, to speed across France, to exploit weaknesses that other generals hesitated to attack, and yet he had to restrain him constantly. From unnecessary risks, from political gaffes, from acts of bravado that could undo victory. Eisenhower's dilemma wasn't just military, it was moral. He knew the Allies could not have won without Patton, but victory came with the cost of babysitting a man who could just as easily destroy the very forces he led. And a truth Eisenhower kept hidden from the public: Patton's greatness was inseparable from his danger. History remembers his bold strikes, his charisma, his victories. But few remember the nights Eisenhower lay awake worrying if Patton's next decision might cost thousands of lives or even the entire campaign. Patton was the ultimate paradox, indispensable and unbearable, brilliant yet reckless. Eisenhower knew that to truly understand Patton, one had to accept that no system could contain him completely, not diplomacy, not orders. Not even Eisenhower himself. The war had ended, yet Patton's fire didn't fade. Victory in Europe should have brought relief. But for Eisenhower, it brought new anxieties. Patton's behavior in post-war Germany was increasingly unrestrained. He spoke freely to troops, criticizing Allied policies, hinting at aggressive stances against the Soviets, and questioning the political decisions of Washington. His words, though often tactically sound, were politically explosive. Eisenhower worried that Patton's bluntness might provoke an international incident, or worse, undermine the fragile post-war order the Allies had fought so hard to achieve. In private, Eisenhower confided to close aides that Patton was now more dangerous than ever. The same audacity that had shattered German defenses could destabilize peace, and no one could predict which move would trigger disaster. Patton openly expressed contempt for the denazification process, for Soviet negotiations, even for Allied commanders who followed bureaucratic procedure instead of bold action. To his soldiers, he was a hero, a living legend who had delivered victory. But to Eisenhower, he was a ticking time bomb, one misstep away from scandal. Every public appearance, every speech, every diary entry had to be carefully monitored. Patton's charisma, which inspired loyalty and fear alike, now threatened the very order Eisenhower sought to establish. Despite the warnings, Eisenhower allowed Patton freedom, knowing that suppressing him entirely could demoralize the men who revered him. But the general's unchecked audacity forced Eisenhower into constant damage control, balancing admiration with caution. By 1945, the post-war landscape became a minefield. And Patton's own brilliance and recklessness meant that Eisenhower's leadership extended beyond the battlefield into politics, diplomacy, and the delicate art of containment. The ceasefire had been declared, but the war for influence was only beginning. Patton, invigorated by victory, saw opportunity, not occupation, in his eyes. The defeat of Germany was just the first step. The next was shaping Europe's future. His aggressive stance toward the Soviets was clear. Containment wasn't enough. He wanted decisive, forceful pressure, even if it risked confrontation. Eisenhower, however, had a broader vision. The fragile alliance between Western powers and the Soviets depended on diplomacy, subtle negotiation, and measured restraint. Every move Patton made, whether a public comment or an unsanctioned tour of military zones, threatened that delicate balance. Eisenhower watched as his most brilliant general pushed boundaries, testing limits that could unravel months of careful planning. One tense morning, Eisenhower received word that Patton had publicly criticized occupation policy in a speech to troops, questioning the authority of Supreme Headquarters and hinting that a more forceful approach was needed. Newspapers didn't print it yet, but the potential fallout was enormous. Eisenhower's calm facade belied his inner turmoil. Patton's charisma made him untouchable in the eyes of soldiers and some allied officials, and his tactical genius had earned him legendary status. But with political recklessness, even the greatest battlefield hero could become a liability. Eisenhower began weighing options: confrontation, containment, or quiet oversight, each with risks that could affect global post-war stability. The clash was inevitable. Patton's unfiltered candor collided with Eisenhower's need for strategic diplomacy. In private, Eisenhower's aides warned him repeatedly. The man who had driven the Third Reich into retreat could now drive a wedge between the Allies themselves. By late 1945, the tension had reached a crescendo. Every decision, every movement, every word by Patton was scrutinized, and Eisenhower understood that a single misstep could undo the fragile victory for which so many had died. By early 1946, Patton's ambition had grown louder, bolder, and far more public. He no longer merely questioned policies behind closed doors. He openly challenged the directives of Allied command, suggesting that Germany needed iron discipline and that the Soviets were an immediate threat, requiring preemptive action. His speeches, though never outright insubordinate, walked a razor's edge, the tone of a hero, the implication of a warlord. Eisenhower, who had long tolerated Patton's battlefield bravado, now faced a stark reality: the general's popularity with troops, his legendary reputation, and his relentless drive could easily translate into political pressure. Allied leaders were watching closely. Any hint that the U.S. military was divided at the highest levels could embolden Soviet negotiators and alarm Washington. Eisenhower understood that Patton's heroism, which had been a strategic asset in war, was becoming a liability in peace. Then came the infamous press incident. Patton, in a series of interviews, criticized occupation policy and subtly undermined the administration's plan for democratization and reconstruction. Headlines didn't yet explode internationally, but the whispers were enough to trigger alarm. Eisenhower's advisers pressed for immediate action, a formal reprimand, reassignment, or even early retirement. Patton, meanwhile, remained unapologetic. He believed his approach was not only correct but morally imperative. "We fought this war to save Europe," he told close aides. "If we falter now in weakness or compromise, all the bloodshed will have been for nothing." For Eisenhower, the dilemma was clear: curb Patton before his recklessness escalated, yet avoid a public conflict that could tarnish both their legacies. The stakes were enormous. Not only was Patton's career at risk, but the fragile post-war order in Europe hung in the balance. A single misstep could turn Allied victory into chaos, and Eisenhower knew he had to act decisively. Eisenhower understood that confronting Patton directly in public would be disastrous. The general was adored by the press, celebrated by the troops, and almost mythologized by the American public. Any overt reprimand risked a backlash, framing Patton as a hero being punished for his honesty. Eisenhower needed a strategy both subtle and firm, a way to contain Patton's influence without igniting a media firestorm. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower began orchestrating a careful plan. He reassigned key staff officers who were known Patton loyalists, ensuring that information and orders flowed through more compliant channels. He controlled which press interviews Patton could give, delaying or editing transcripts when necessary. Each action was deliberate, designed to keep Patton operationally effective while subtly curbing his public platform. Meanwhile, Patton remained oblivious to the tightening grip. He continued to advocate for aggressive policies. In Germany, criticizing the administration's cautious approach, he warned in speeches to small groups of officers that the Soviets were already plotting dominance in Europe and that the U.S. must act before it was too late. Eisenhower, privy to every word, realized that patience was wearing thin. The tension between necessity and loyalty grew almost unbearable. In these months, the stage was set for a confrontation that could define both men's legacies. Patton's unyielding drive for action, once a war-winning asset, now posed a threat to the fragile alliance and the delicate post-war order. Eisenhower had to decide: rein Patton in permanently, or risk letting his boldness destabilize everything they had fought for. The world watched quietly, unaware that behind the scenes, one of history's most legendary duos was balancing on a knife's edge. By late 1945, Patton's frustrations had reached a boiling point. Every directive that slowed his ambitions, every check on his movements, every carefully worded memo from Eisenhower was perceived as an affront. Patton, accustomed to being the unstoppable force on the battlefield, struggled to accept that the war was over and that diplomacy now dictated military decisions. His famed temper, once a tool for motivating troops, now clashed with the delicate politics of occupation. Patton began bypassing traditional channels. He sent unofficial letters to Congress, subtly criticizing the policies of the Joint Chiefs and hinting at the dangers of Soviet intentions in Europe. These documents, intended for a select few, leaked to the press, creating whispers of dissent in Washington. Eisenhower, reading each word with growing unease, realized that the public's perception of Patton could undermine the entire post-war strategy. The man who had stormed through France was now a threat to America's delicate diplomatic position. Behind the scenes, Eisenhower convened private meetings with his closest advisors. They debated whether to confront Patton openly or continue controlling his influence quietly. Every option carried risks. A direct confrontation could provoke a public scandal, while inaction might embolden Patton to act independently, possibly destabilizing the Allied occupation of Germany. Eisenhower knew that history would judge both men harshly if a misstep occurred. Despite the tension, Patton continued to assert himself in occupied Germany. His presence inspired soldiers and civilians alike, but also alarmed diplomats who feared his unrestrained energy. The clash between military brilliance and political prudence was reaching its peak. The question remained: could Eisenhower rein in a man whose audacity had defined an era, without destroying the very tool that had won the war? Eisenhower knew that subtle warnings and quiet oversight were no longer enough. Patton's influence in Germany was growing. His speeches, tours, and personal interventions were being reported by the press and carefully noted by Washington. If left unchecked, Patton could overshadow the carefully orchestrated plans of the Allied occupation, potentially giving political leverage to factions Eisenhower distrusted, including emerging tensions with the Soviets. In early 1946, Eisenhower made a decisive move. He quietly reassigned Patton to a less sensitive administrative post, officially under the guise of logistical oversight and training. It was framed as an honor, a recognition of his battlefield accomplishments, but it effectively removed him from any operational power in Europe. For Eisenhower, this was a delicate balance. He had to contain Patton's influence without publicly humiliating him, knowing that such an act could fracture morale among the troops who revered him. Patton, however, immediately sensed the maneuver. Though outwardly compliant, his private correspondence revealed simmering resentment. He wrote scathing critiques of occupation policies, predicting dire consequences if the Allies underestimated the political landscape. Officers close to him were torn between loyalty and fear. Patton's charisma was undeniable, but his recklessness had become a liability. Rehook moment, whispers of mutiny and disobedience began circulating among lower-ranking officers, hinting that Eisenhower's decision might not fully quell the general's ambitions. The situation escalated during a high-level meeting in Frankfurt. Eisenhower addressed the room with precision and authority, acknowledging Patton's extraordinary contributions while subtly warning that the war's end had shifted priorities. Patton's eyes burned with intensity, but he nodded, outwardly controlled, yet inwardly plotting his next move. In that room, two titans faced off, one wielding the power of command, the other fueled by unrestrained ambition. The tension was palpable. Even seasoned diplomats held their breath. This bold reassignment marked a turning point. Patton's battlefield days were over, but his legend, influence, and the questions he raised about military strategy and politics were far from silenced. Eisenhower had acted decisively, but at what cost? Even in a diminished role, Patton could not be contained. Reports reached Eisenhower from intelligence officers, noting that Patton was engaging with local German officials in ways that blurred the lines between allied oversight and personal influence. He held informal meetings, visited sensitive sites, and made off-the-record comments that worried both American and British authorities. While some argued that his experience could aid reconstruction, Eisenhower feared the optics. Patton's charisma and authority could easily be misinterpreted as sympathy for former Nazi elements, a politically explosive perception in post-war Europe. Patton's defiance was subtle but deliberate. He meticulously documented the administrative failures he saw, circulating pointed memos to sympathetic contacts in Washington. His words carried weight because they were backed by undeniable battlefield credibility. Rumors spread of him privately criticizing Eisenhower's cautious approach, advocating for rapid, unilateral action in ways that alarmed allied governments. Allies whispered about Patton's vision of Europe, a vision dangerously divorced from diplomatic reality. Tensions peaked in 1946 when a speech he gave to military personnel in Heidelberg drew media attention. He praised German soldiers' valor in combat, contrasting it with what he described as bureaucratic inefficiency of occupation policies. Newspapers sensationalized his comments, framing them as dangerously sympathetic to former enemies. The U.S. State Department demanded clarification. Eisenhower called for restraint, and yet Patton remained unapologetic. Whispers of an impending confrontation between the two generals spread like wildfire through both military and political circles. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower considered his options carefully. Removing Patton outright risked a public scandal. Letting him roam freely risked political disaster. He convened a council of trusted officers, debating whether to transfer Patton back to the United States or quietly shift him into retirement. Every choice carried risk. Every action could alter the fragile balance of post-war Europe. Patton's legacy, his personal vendetta against bureaucracy, and his refusal to stay silent made him a living embodiment of the post-war dilemma. Brilliant, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. The moment of truth arrived in late 1946. Eisenhower, fully aware that Patton's brilliance came entwined with danger, scheduled a private meeting in a modest office at SHAF headquarters. The air was tense, every gesture, every glance weighed heavily. Patton entered with his usual confidence, unaware that this would be a pivotal encounter, not just between two men, but between the imperatives of military necessity and political prudence. Eisenhower wasted no time laying out the gravity of the situation. Patton's unauthorized actions, controversial speeches, and growing political influence were jeopardizing not just Allied authority in Europe, but America's diplomatic credibility. Patton listened, rarely blinking, his face a mask of controlled defiance. He argued that his methods, his insistence on swift action, his blunt assessment of German capabilities were necessary to secure long-term peace and stability. Yet Eisenhower countered with measured precision, pointing out the dangers of perception, the fragility of post-war reconstruction, and the moral responsibility of leadership. Eisenhower reminded Patton that a single misstep could undo years of sacrifice, that the war had ended, but the battles of influence and legacy were just beginning. The conversation stretched for hours, alternating between tension and reflection. Finally, Patton, confronted with the inexorable logic of Eisenhower's position, acquiesced, not out of defeat, but out of recognition that some fights were better waged in history books than in political reality. He agreed to curtail his public commentary, accept a formal advisory role, and avoid direct involvement in occupation administration. Eisenhower, in turn, allowed him to retain enough autonomy to preserve his dignity and voice, a fragile compromise that maintained both order and honor. In the years that followed, Patton's legend only grew, shaped by memoirs, biographies, and the mythos of his battlefield daring. Eisenhower's quiet stewardship ensured that Patton's brilliance contributed to the post-war vision without destabilizing it. The world would remember Patton as audacious, fearless, and sometimes reckless, but it was Eisenhower's disciplined foresight that tempered those qualities, ensuring that America's victory translated into lasting peace. If you found this deep dive into Eisenhower and Patton's post-war struggle fascinating, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment below. Share your thoughts on whether Patton's boldness was a gift or a danger. Stay tuned to World War Ashes for more untold stories that shaped history, stories of courage, controversy, and the men who made decisions that changed the world forever.